In northwestern Europe, towards the end of the 4th millennium BCE, something dramatic happened. The construction of megalithic tombs came to an end, and this coincided with a significant decline in populations. What caused such a collapse remains a mystery. Some researchers point to disease, possibly even the plague. In Scandinavia, the aftermath brought major change. Incoming groups with steppe ancestry replaced earlier Neolithic farming communities. But in other regions, these original farming genetic signatures persisted. So why did they stop building megalithic graves? Was it just a cultural shift or something deeper? A new DNA study suggests an answer, and it's not what many expected. Complex megalithic tombs were a characteristic feature of Neolithic northwestern Europe. This megalithic architecture took different forms depending on the cultural group that created it, and included passage tombs as well as kist graves. The construction of these collective megalithic tombs stopped towards the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE. At the same time as this, populations dipped rather dramatically. This turning point is often called the Neolithic decline. It didn't happen at the same time everywhere, and of course it didn't happen overnight, but it marked a profound period of change for northwestern Europe. Over the years, researchers have tried to figure out what caused the Neolithic decline. Some believe it was driven by environmental degradation from overfarming. Others suggest rising disease as people and animals lived in closer quarters within farming communities, possibly even the spread of plague. In Scandinavia, this decline in population made it easier for groups with steppe ancestry to move in and ultimately replace the Neolithic farmers. However, a similar situation didn't occur elsewhere. Something more complex was going on. To investigate this mystery, researchers turned to a remarkable burial site at Brueil, about 50 kilometers north of Paris. Their new study, published in the journal Nature, Ecology and Evolution, outlines genetic research carried out on individuals within this Neolithic burial site. This tomb, known as an Allées sépulcrale, is a long stone-built passage grave, partly underground, partly above. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of 316 individuals. These burials fall into two distinct phases. The earliest dating to between 3200 and 3100 BCE, and the second dating to the first few centuries of the 3rd millennium BCE. The Phase 1 individuals were carefully aligned along the axis of the grave, but the Phase 2 individuals have no particular orientation. For the study, the researchers analysed DNA from 182 individuals, allowing them to reconstruct not just ancestry, but family relationships and social structure across the generations. The samples were divided into two chronological phases by using stratigraphy, burial behaviour, and accompanying radiocarbon dates from the excavation. These results were then completed using data from the European Research Council-funded advanced grant, The Times of Their Lives. This chronology was later confirmed and refined. One of the first surprises was that genetic sexing confirmed 71% of individuals in Phase 1 and 73% of individuals in Phase 2 were male. That's far from what you would expect in a natural population. It suggests that this tomb wasn't for everyone. Many females were excluded, pointing to a highly selective burial practice. Mitochondrial DNA passed through mothers was diverse, but Y chromosome DNA passed through fathers was much less varied. This tells us something important, that these communities were organized around male lineages. Genetically, all individuals belong to the broader group of Neolithic farmers, but when researchers looked closer, a major shift emerged. Phase 1 individuals were closely related to local populations in the Paris Basin and Western Germany. Phase 2 individuals, however, showed strong connections to southern France and Iberia. Even more striking, the two groups didn't share any genetic segments at all. Also, population size estimates revealed that the Phase 1 individuals had been in a smaller community than those belonging to Phase 2, and that the Phase 1 community had shrunk recently at the point of sampling. In other words, this wasn't the same population evolving over time. It was a population replacement, at least in part. The data suggests that people with Iberian ancestry were already present in small numbers during Phase 1. Then, after around 2900 BCE, larger migrations from the south reshaped the population of the Paris Basin. By Phase 2, around 80% of individuals carried Iberian ancestry. So rather than a simple collapse, we're looking at a movement. People relocating across regions and reshaping communities. Another possibility is that a few Phase 1 individuals with Iberian DNA proliferated in that population and dominated it in Phase 2. However, in this case, there would be a bottleneck in Phase 2, similar population sizes in both phases and higher levels of population continuity. The data supports the idea that some individuals with Iberian ancestry were present in the Paris Basin in Phase 1 and further migrations from the south took place in Phase 2. Quite why this migration northwards took place isn't certain, but there could have been particular factors that encouraged it. After the end of Phase 2, steppe ancestry appears in the Paris Basin, and this is associated with the Belgica culture. The genetic data also reveals a shift in how these societies were organized. In Phase 1, about 75% of individuals had at least one first or second degree relative buried within the same tomb. Large multi-generational family groups dominated. In Phase 2, this number was much lower, at around 40%. No genetic relatedness was found between individuals of different phases, further emphasizing that these were two separate populations with different types of burial behavior. Overall, 14 pedigrees were identified, 7 for each phase. In Phase 1, there were no cases where males from outside the family line had entered into the group and had children with its members. All males were genetically descended from earlier members of the group. However, all females except for one were found to be related exclusively to their offspring, which suggests that female exogamy was practiced within this community. The largest pedigree from Phase 1 is 1.A and is made up of 29 sequenced and 19 inferred individuals. These inferred individuals were either not sampled or were buried outside this tomb. 3 brothers formed the founding generation. The second largest pedigree from Phase 1 is 1.B and spans 4 generations from a founder couple. During Phase 2, the tomb was used for smaller patrilineal lineages and unrelated individuals. No correlation could be found between the burial position of the individuals within the grave and their genetic relationship to one another. So here we can see that something fundamental had changed, not just who lived in this community at Brueil, but how society was organized there. The researchers found the earliest diverging lineage of Yersinia pestis at Brueil. Yersinia pestis is the bacteria that causes the plague. All samples were screened for pathogen DNA and, in addition to Yersinia pestis, which was found in 3 individuals from Phase 1 and 1 from Phase 2, they also found Yersinia enterolytica, the cause of yersiniosis, Borrelia recurrentis, the cause of louse-borne relapsing fever, and human alpha herpes virus 1. Could it be that an outbreak of the plague caused Phase 1 to come to an end? Possibly, but the evidence isn't definitive. The number of infected individuals is relatively low, and they don't cluster at the very end of the phase, as would be expected. However, this tomb represents only part of the population. If many people died elsewhere or were buried differently, the archaeological record might not capture the full impact of such an epidemic. Environmental data adds another layer of evidence to solve the mystery. Pollen data from the Paris Basin was analysed to see if vegetational changes took place between Phase 1 and Phase 2. The researchers found that forest regeneration took place between 2900 and 2500 BCE. This usually happens when human activity declines, Fields are abandoned and forests grow back. Similar incidences had been found previously in data for Neolithic Scandinavia and northern Germany, as well as during the Justinian plague in the mid-1st century and the Black Death in medieval times. So this pollen data supports the idea that a significant population decline did take place between Phase 1 and Phase 2. The end of Europe's megalithic building era wasn't caused by a single event. Instead, this study paints a more complex picture of population decline, possibly brought about by disease. This then left a void for new peoples to migrate into the area. In the Paris Basin, these new people came from Iberia and reused the tomb at Brueil, but did not create any megalithic graves themselves. Eventually, people with steppe ancestry did move into the Paris Basin and replace the Phase 2 population, just as had happened around 4700 BCE in Scandinavia. But in the Paris Basin, this happened much later and was preceded by two quite different Neolithic farming populations living in the area. So the Neolithic decline wasn't just a collapse, it was a transformation. Communities fragmented, new groups arrived, old traditions like megalith building faded away. Let me know what you think about the Neolithic decline in the comments. Why do you think these populations from Iberia moved northwards to the Paris Basin? I suppose further research needs to look into what acted as a catalyst for those population movements. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.